Arthur Miller, emeritus special collections librarian and archivist at Lake Forest College. He is known about Market Square for almost half a century and has been active in the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation since the 1990s. He will discuss Market Square, a unique and well-known complex that served as a model for 1920s early shopping centers. The plan grew out of Shaw's imagination, but also many unique factors. Chicago with its rise and social upheavals, the unique history and planning in Lake Forest dating back to the 1950s, and the split between lakefront and prairie. As soon as Art has concluded his talk, we will have a short break while we reset the area up front for our panel discussion, which will be led by Susan Burian, and that will commence about 12:30. So with that, I welcome Arthur Miller.
Howard Shaw's Market Square in Lake Forest, 1916, was the first built and occupied in the U.S. City Beautiful movement and also English-style Garden City town center. This artful suburban cluster facing a train station was commercially driven and planned also around motor vehicles. It was a model for what evolved in the 20th century into shopping centers. It actually also paid a good return by 2019 standards. Now, when Market Square in Lake Forest was completed and then written about in publications in 1917, including by Peter B. White, the work of the 1909 Plan of Chicago was still only in process. The Michigan Avenue double-decker bridge and the Wacker Drive were not completed. The bridge only by 1920. The Field Museum on new, unlandscaped, rough landfill south of Grant Park would not be opened until early May 1921. Buckingham Fountain in 1916 was still a decade into the future. So in the 20th century, Shaw's architecture at Market Square remains much as he created it, and his landscape and hardscape as well are now under their third owner. But his trees have been replaced, and the whole park and paved areas have been redone in 2000. Its uses today, though, are more focused on commercial and office uses, with the original rental apartments and social settlement functions relocated within the community. Howard Van Doren Shaw had been in the community since he built his summer place for his family, Ragdale, in 1897-98. Here he's shown with his daughter around 1920. This sculpted medallion by his daughter, Sylvia Shaw Judson, was done when he was 49, around 1919. It reflects his accomplishments and also forecasts his award in 1926 as he lay dying of the AIA's Gold Medal. It was mentioned before that it was only the fifth American, but this is the first given to a Midwestern practicing architect. And we remember Stuart's slide of the view from the New Yorker magazine of the country only going out to the Pacific Ocean after the Hudson. So this was them recognizing that there was a Midwest. That was certainly good. This copy of this medallion was made by Paul Myers, who was given the original by a Shaw family member, and Myers donated this copy to Lake Forest College. The AIA had met in 1924 in Chicago, as reported by Virginia A. Green for her pioneering 1998 book on Shaw and his work. The AIA visiting members had been impressed by the new Donnelley plant, which we saw in a couple of previous presentations, that was designed by Shaw and going up at 22nd Street. Its heavy concrete floors and supports were built to absorb the vibrations of the many new high-speed electric presses that had revolutionized mass printing. The new building under construction that impressed the AIA visitors was completed after Shaw's death. talking about the organization of the plans and how it got started. They bought the property in mid-1912, a group of informal local estate owners who'd gotten sick of getting off the train and facing a bunch of ramshackle shacks across the street from the beautiful 1900 train station by Frost and Granger. They were first of three plans for the new town center at Lake Forest. Was completed in December of 1912. Not just any time in 1912, but in December, 4 months after the land opposite the 1900 train station was purchased. Shaw associate David Adler was apparently involved in the design of this first version called Town Market. This first plan featured a pair of identical lower towers like this picturesque one. Adler left Shaw's office for his own firm in residential practice with Henry Dangler, a Lake Forester, in January of 1913, the very next month. A tower of similar picturesque helmet type, for example, is found in Bratislava, Slovakia, near Vienna. Stephen Salny's 2005 book on Frances Elkins, David Adler's decorator's sister, observes that Elkins, while Adler was studying in Paris, accompanied her brother on forays through Europe that greatly influenced his words, both of them. Certainly this included, the travels would have included Vienna with its Joseph Hoffman Villa Primavesi, seen in Adler's 1927 Clough House, but constructed, the Hoffman House constructed in the 1910s. And Bratislava was just a short train ride east of Vienna. The 1912 town market plan is known from plans uncovered in 1900 by local historian Shirley Paddock. In the 1916 moved into Market Square office of Market Square developer manager John Griffith, and it was still owned in 1999 by the successors. The existence of the plans and papers was not known, unfortunately, when Susan Dart did her book on Market Square in 1984. Shirley is shown second from the left, behind the fellow who is hogging the shot here, you see. Between the two 1912 identical towers was proposed a low, two-storied classical building that continued the arcade that, as built still today, runs under the south and north sides of the plaza east of the towers. Most of the 1912 plans, sadly, are too fragile still and torn for copying and much in need of conservation. The central building of 1912 may recall Palladio's mid-16th century Palazzo Circati, Vicenza, Italy, 2 levels with an arcade and columns, 2 levels of columns, and then an arcade below. The 1912 central building shows some similarity also to the classic factory entry facade to the Lever factory at Port Sunlight, a garden city near Liverpool. An April 15th, 1915 Chicago Daily News article from the cache of Griffith Improvement Trust papers cites Port Sunlight directly as a source for Market Square. The trust had been organized formally back in 2013, soon after they purchased the land, and the plans were drawn, first plans. Now, a second plan, before we get to the second plan, the post office in Port Sunlight sets a precedent for the 2 stories and a tall attic of the traditional south and north buildings at the Lake Forest Town Center complex. Port Sunlight postcards from Adler's collection also appear in Stephen Salny's 2001 monograph on Adler. This photo of the east end of the 1916 built complex shows the base of the south tower as above and the 2-story with attic and gable ends template. The classic building in 1912's Town Market came forward toward us, like this, from the base of the tower. A small rectangular park parallel to Western Avenue, the street, was east of the towers and classic building with a fountain. Well, there was a bunch of buildings behind it that had no view, no access to the train station. It was just a bunch of buildings, and nobody wanted it. So they did another plan by 1914, and it was to include a library, a classic building at the west end of the plan, suggesting that they also were bidding to include a public municipal financing angle to help pay for the town center project. This picture is from the 1931 classic library, actually built, but quite a bit later and in a different location. But global events intervened. The European War, pointing the estate owning improvement trust leaders, Cyrus McCormick Jr., Chicago developer Arthur Aldous of the Monadnock Building, Howard Shaw and John Griffith, all members of the YWCA Club in Lake Forest, back toward the private financing approach. As you can see, the war came along. Chicago businesses were providing munitions and food, materials, transportation for all this, etc., for the Europeans, and one can assume at substantial profits. The steel industry is represented here by the around 1907 built Shaw-designed Ryerson Steel warehouse and offices surviving on Chicago's west side. This is a striking modern building for its day, using square motifs as seen in Secessionist Viennese designs, here in clusters and with variety. The building, as it is listed in Virginia A. Green's book, is located at 2582 West 16th Street, Chicago, which today is the location of Cinespace Film Studios. It also recalls Richardson's Chicago Fields Warehouse of 1886, demolished with its clusterings of windows. And it is a little ahead of Barron's 1908 to 1912, completed in 1912, later turbine plant in Berlin, an icon of modern design, and also with clustered, repeating fenestration. Shaw's strikingly modern and handsome Ryerson warehouse, by 1908, though, languishes today in complete obscurity. The massing of this 1899 Secessionist hall at Vienna by German Joseph Olbrich in the same era suggests to the massing of Unity Temple, Oak Park by Wright, and later perhaps the South and North Market Square or Town Market 1912 buildings in that plan's twin towers in front and the orb that add curves to the otherwise rectangular forms. Curves survive on the 1916 North Tower also. These two preliminary plans led to Shaw's breakout 1915 reconfiguration of the plan in Market Square. Here is a long park space perpendicular rather than parallel to Western Avenue and pushing the central building a full block west. And it was drawn in 1915 and completed by 1916. Ta-da! Here is the final plan of 1915. Two long buildings that curl around the two towers, welcoming visitors into the main space off of Western Avenue and from the facing train station. The long buildings in the park at the west end, and the west end building, and then behind it was a gym. A fountain remains in the new plaza on the east, where the earlier park had been. This detail of that plan of 1915 shows the change from 1912 and the 1914 plans, where the central building ran between the two towers and just west of the fountain. South, west, and north of the little park were covered arcades like this, going around, goes around the fountain. You can see there, the central building would have gone all the way around. The 1915 plan combined in new ways from 1912 and 1914 classic, Tudor, and modern design. It was built in 2 stages, first west behind Western Avenue, where there used to be barns and things, and behind those old stores, and then east, replacing the stores, all finally occupied by late 1916. The final design is highly contextual, and here steps down from 3 stories at the 1903 Anderson block in 2 steps to two stories, and then steps back from the transitional, independently owned 19 Shaw-designed drugstore to the Truss South building. This leads visitors into the space. The 3-story building, by the way, is by James Gamble Rogers, who was not chopped liver either. The final plan incorporates 4 types of uses. Here, showing the first and main generator of revenue, the stores, with their plate glass windows, modern, really, shop windows, as seen by the detraining public on the east. This increased by 300% in the top rental space, noted by historian Richard Longstreth in 1997, was crucial to the income of 3 or 4% on an artful project. Between the shops are entries to stairways, more like Jacob's ladder, climbing ever higher, leading up to the second floor residential rental apartments, and later some offices. But there were really 30 apartments upstairs, and we don't think of Market Square as residential, but it really was a neighborhood. The apartments were not particularly notable for their plans. They looked like plans from the 1890s of Pond and Pond apartments that have been published and things. They had air shafts, but they were for the shopkeepers below. So there was an arts and crafts idea of incorporating where you live with where you work, not separating things out. The almost 30 apartments added to the mix of local middle-class housing, complementing a Shaw-designed 1906-1907 designed nearby West Park community of about 80 or 90 lots and owned homes. Note the styles brought together here. Traditional half-timbering on the second floor level above, but classic below, the Diocletian arched window, the cornice, and the brackets framing the doorway, and the modern store window on the right. So Stewart pointed it out as a characteristic of Shaw's. The post office of 1916 to 1932 was at the west end of the north building with 4 classic pillars with a traditional apartment space above, the shutters and the window. You can see there's a window box space there just above. So they have 2 really very different. This is residential right above the fancy post office. A 4th type of use after offices, apartments, and stores was social settlement work by the estate owners, who were the main purchasers of shares. Shown here left is the 2-story Young Men's Club, 1916, related to that neighborhood that was built earlier at Shaw's layout, behind or west of the West Classic building, with a gymnasium above. This is accessed by a second-floor bridge over that little alley that you see on the right. The second-floor bridge from the upstairs of the Classic West building for the YWCA. Its entry then, now removed, shown just east of the gym building across the alley. So there was an entry for the women as well as for the men. This worked out pretty well. The YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, was first of all a safe, sociable refuge for young women, maids' afternoon off, and using the gym while the young men were at work. And most innovative, too, the organization of the buildings and the park around parking for automobiles in front of the shops, and accommodation for trucks, at that time about the size of today's SUVs, accessing the shops from the alleys behind south and north. These have now been repurposed as more social spaces, kind of little muse-type areas. As mentioned, there are three major styles that are employed here, really. They are not just collected, which kind of, that's what eclectic means to me, kind of collected together, but they were blended, combined, or integrated. Classic was key to the 1915 plan, the order of the elemental plan of the four main buildings, the surviving fountain, the stronger two-story columns of the west building, to be seen from a station a block away, and especially the new taller tower. Columns, simple Tuscan, is also come from Palladio, drawing on another couple of 16th century projects of Palladio's. The column is at the heart of all classical design. Now here's an example we saw earlier, sorry about that, but Shaw's 1907 Ginn Company, which was down in the South Prairie Avenue neighborhood, now demolished in the South Prairie Avenue neighborhood. 4 stories are shown here, with 3 of them with 3-story tall columns really dominating the front facade. And Shaw's 1907 Mentor Building is one of the Loop's most columnar structures on State Street, adjacent to the famous Louis Sullivan designed department store block. Shown here are the 4-story retail levels of the base of the Mentor Building, the several stories of the shaft of the column following the Prairie School horizontal window type of the department store, and the temple-like entablature at the top. Market Square's North Building had more classic style, from the post office on the west to the new taller of the 2 towers on the east, designed by Shaw for the 1915 plan. Again, a column with a limestone base, with the window in it there we see at the base. It's running bond brick shaft. It's stucco frieze with its classic sundial versus the late Middle Ages clock on the other side. And its lantern and cap, somewhat Christopher Wren-like. Again, though, there's still a curve. There are still some curves very visible here, carried over. The octagonal fountain is at the east end of the park's greensward. Its base is supported by a pair of blank shields on the sides and eagles at the corners. Eagles are, they're for Adler in German, and it's sort of a bow by Shaw to Adler's contribution to the original plan. Second main type is Tudor or English traditional. This was a style that was then resurgent in Britain, of a vernacular revival of the small town planning. The long south building with its half timbering shows this character. The south tower certainly anchors the vernacular style there. The half timbering of Normandy we see. On the south side, there also is faced into the 1912 small park. There's that arcade that went around this 3 sides of the old park. Here is a variant straight across the eastern plaza, just that side. And then here on the 4th side, or first side, if you want to say it, because it was built in 1900, of the square is the 1900 train station, showing here the Tudor east facade across from Market Square, opposite side, by Frost and Granger, local Chicago architects. 2 gable ends with a forward-thrusting roof between, 2 piers supporting a porch roof for an off-center entry. Does this ring a bell to anybody? Ding! There it is. It's lots of similar elements to a building that was built the year before, completed in 1898, the Ragdale House. The drawings for the train station started in 1899. Granger and Shaw worked together for William LeBaron Jenney. The third style is modern. Its roots are in Louis Sullivan's work in Chicago, in Olbrich and others in Vienna, and reformers in Britain such as Mackintosh, Bailey Scott, Unwin, Lutyens, and others around Europe. Shaw knew of these innovations, their simplicity, and including their use of established architectural vocabularies for new ideas. Here, the simplicity of the columnar North Tower is juxtaposed with traditional stepped gable. But that faux gable end also looks a lot like the zigzag that would be a signature element in the next decade's Art Deco. This is a little motif up at the top. You see these recessed squares. We saw squares on the automobile store at the earlier presentation too, that Bill showed. There were lots of squares there, but here these squares are indented into there in a regular base, on a regular way. At the base, they're squares that are things are coming forward from. 4 limestone elements jutting out from square spaces. I think this comes originally from Sullivan, or lots of it is shown by him. The park is in the middle is modern as well. Simple, originally in 1917, just greensward, tall elms brought in a mature height with the branches above the second floor in 2 rows. Columnar, repeating the pattern of the columns on the west, and on the east, the piers on both sides of the plaza. And the plaza itself comes from, you see it in the plan of 1909 for Chicago. Jules Gorin's great illustrations show great plazas. And that space is used for lighting the Christmas trees in Lake Forest the day after Thanksgiving. Here people are gathered. The park itself is still very simple. It's a flat plain, really, not very much relief to that, except the paths were added about 1940. This is a 2000 version of the paths. The fountain here in the front shows a sculpture that was added in 1983 by Sylvia Shaw Judson, based on a Paul Manship earlier sculpture. So there are things that are modern and also traditional. And here finally is a picture of a Memorial Day observance in the park itself, and people using the square. So without further ado, I will end. Thank you. Now you can clap. Right.